truly we need to be wide awake. This really is a clash of civilizations. And there is something within Islam which has demonstrated for all 14 centuries an animus, an aggressiveness toward the West. The problem is Islam itself. How do you deal with that argument?
I think, again, you have to go to the political blueprint. If you take the American founding fathers, it's about 200 and something years old. It's a relatively young philosophy.
Oh, I see. Yep.
Yeah.
By comparison with Islam, it's young. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Even if you take classical liberalism, these are relatively young ideas. And then even younger, you get to communism and all the rest of it. So if you think of Islam as a political philosophy, it's really one of the oldest ideas, one of the oldest governing principles. It's not Western. It is not as organized, and it doesn't make logical sense to the Western mind, the Western mind of today. I think back then, if you read some of the works of, Gibbons and beyond that, they seemed to have understood what they were dealing with back then. But today, it seems to me that there are very few people in the West who really think that they understand the layeredness of Islam. That's why we need qualifiers like radical and extreme and fundamentalist. These are all words. This is a vocabulary that we use for Christianity and for Western phenomena that we then try to put on a different civilization. So I think first we have to acknowledge, yes, this is an old political philosophy. It's been around for a long time, and we don't understand it. Part of it is also we don't want to understand it. Why don't we want to understand it? I don't know the answer to that question, but again, let me speculate. If you get deep into the values and the principles that are promoted from within the political Islamic doctrine, and you put them next to our, Western political ideas,
yes,
you get to a place of zero-sum games.
Either it's that or it's that. They're incompatible.
It becomes
no
binary.
Society can be both.
Yeah, no society can be both. And the contemporary Western mind is taught to collaborate, to cooperate, to compromise.
Pluralism,
tolerance, all to me fantastic ideas and a fantastic attitude toward the world. But sometimes you get to a place where it is impossible to compromise. And I think deep down, the contemporary Western mind just, it's not that we don't get it, it's that when you get it, then what?
Right. We don't want, all right, you made about 3 points that I want to follow up on. But first, you quote here in the Challenge of Dawah, and then you mentioned it again in your testimony before Congress. You quote Karl Popper. Karl Popper is middle 20th century philosopher, the man, a great defender of what he termed the open society. There's Popper, Hayek, a number of others, and Popper's this tremendously important intellectual figure for defending the West as it had evolved by the middle of the last century.
Yeah.
And Karl Popper believes in tolerance up to a point.
Yes.
Let me quote him. This is a passage that you footnoted, so I looked up the passage. He's writing in 1945, and clearly he has in mind fascism and communism. But here's what Popper writes. As long as we, Westerners, as long as we can counter intolerant philosophies by rational argument and keep them in check by public opinion, suppression would certainly be unwise. But we should claim the right to suppress them if necessary, even by force.
Yeah.
We should claim that any movement preaching intolerance places itself outside the law, and we should consider incitement to intolerance and persecution as criminal in the same way as we should consider incitement to murder or kidnapping or to the revival of the slave trade as criminal. Close quote. So here you have this paradox that in order to sustain a tolerant society, you need to draw very sharp lines around it and say this inside, as much tolerance as we can manage, but there are lines, and outside we claim the right to suppress the intolerant. Now, That is extremely strong language.
Yeah.
And there were people even at the time who thought that was going a little far
Yeah.
toward communism, for example. Do you want to amend this language in any way as a statement of principle for the way we ought to deal with Islam? Because the tightness of religious belief and political theory, it's so closely intertwined with a fundamental outlook on man's relation to God. Do you want to amend? Do you want to soften it, or do you want to let Popper stand as a kind of guiding principle for us?
I would like to let Popper stand. And again, I'm glad you mentioned 1945, 1947.
Mm-hmm.
We're just coming out of the Second World War.
Yes.
In the West, we've just been confronted with an ideology that was impossible to compromise with.
Yes.
And if you remember the early days, the conversations between Chamberlain and Churchill, Chamberlain thought that he could talk some sense into Hitler.
Yes.
He thought he could negotiate. He thought
peace in our time.
Peace in our times.
Right.
Appeasement would work. So that was the softening of the language. That was the softening of the attitude toward, you see this evil. You really think it just can't be true. This man must want something other than just go down a path that could possibly destroy all of us.
And this is part of the pattern that I take it as you identify.
Yeah.
Even as in those days, confronting Hitler, Chamberlain, the people the appeasement crowd, they thought, oh yes, he talks that way, but he doesn't really believe it.
Yeah.
Likewise, during the Cold War, much of the left said, oh, no, that the communist stuff, that's just rhetoric.
Yeah.
Actually, they're just a great power. They want their own sphere of influence. They want a little economic growth.
Yeah.
They don't really believe it.
Yeah.
And you argue that we're making much the same mistake, that the radical Islamists, those who propose the political Islam, they really believe it.
They really believe it, and here they demonstrate it. They teach their children. They sacrifice the lives of their children. What is more valuable to one than their own children? So they sacrifice the lives and the futures of their own children. They sacrifice their own careers. There are men, the big famous example is bin Laden, but he's not the only one, who were born into privilege, financial privilege, in that context, clan and tribal privilege. Their families are well respected and honored. They're princes. And they set all that aside. They go to some hellhole in Afghanistan, and they start promoting these ideas with absolutely everything that they have, everything in them. I can't think of a better illustration, a better demonstration of conviction than that kind of conviction. And it trickles down. It trickles down to the man who takes a van after he's thought all things through to run people over, knowing he's going to kill these people, but that he runs the risk of being shot by the police. That is a clear demonstration of conviction. So if you want, take some of the, I don't know if you follow some of what goes on in the Palestinian territory, but some of these people who kill and die while killing others, those who die as they're considered to be martyrs, you have streets and squares named after them. They are seen within the community of radical Muslims as heroes. They're celebrated. They're celebrated more than we celebrate the Founding Fathers, more than we celebrate any of our Western heroes. And what other demonstration do you want of conviction than that?
Right.
We can go on and say they're mad and, they're deprived, they're this, they're that. Deprivation plays a role, but it is not the cause. And sometimes I would say, I think to me and to you probably, it's madness to take your life. It's madness to take other people's lives. But
there's something weirdly appealing about it.
Yeah.
The conviction, the force of conviction.
Yeah.
Well, this is my speculation. You know the answer to this. My speculation. Why do we see radicalization of Muslims in the suburbs of Paris?
Yeah.
Well, here's the question. Why is it that young men, overwhelmingly men, in the last year or 2 years, left countries in the West, including a few from this country, but many from France, many from Germany, some from Britain, to go fight with ISIS, who were clearly leading these are not people who were showering. They were at risk. They were dangerous. They were. But there's something about the purity of conviction that just does exercise an appeal. We are built to respond to belief.
To belief, to something higher than yourself. And Karl Popper describes in The Open Society and Its Enemies, he describes that, in his criticism of Popper, in his criticism of Hegel, he describes how this transcendence of, the human being subjected to being an instrument in this higher goal.
Right.
Islam does that, but even better, because it's to God. It's a religious, you see, Plato's argument, Hegel's arguments were all secular, they were man-made. Those who were convinced to go on that path had to be persuaded. But here it's the ultimate power. It's God.
Right.